No, so last week was the first week we actually did not finish a lesson. There was so much material to cover that we had to stop at a reasonable time, and we're going to pick up there. And I think that this lesson, I think there is few enough key events that we'll be able to finish up and get through this lesson. If not, it'll just be a whole mess, and we'll keep going from there and see what happens. But quick recap, we'll pray, and then we'll start. Quick recap. Who remembers, where did we leave King Saul last week? He was with the Witch of Endor. And we'll cover it a little bit. And do we remember where we left David? David is with his band of merry men in Philistine territory, in the enemy's territory, and he built his own, he was kind of given/built his own city for his group of people. That was Ziklag, if you remember that name. That's the name of his city in Philistine territory. So last week we saw David on the run. We saw a lot of gray area where he tells a lot of lies, a lot of mistruths that save his skin, but we're kind of uncomfortable with the ethics of it from time to time. But then we do see his ethic regarding King Saul, why he's on the run, why he didn't just strike back. He won't touch the Lord's anointed. That is his ethic. He knows God is giving him the throne, but he will not have that be by his hand. He won't strike out against God's king. He's going to let God work it out in his time. We see David spare Saul's life twice when he could have killed him. And then we see Saul, he seeks God because the Philistines are coming after him. The Philistines are mounting an army. Saul prays to God and gets no answer. So he seeks this Witch of Endor. I'll say my thing later. Okay. He seeks the witch, and from the witch, she brings up the spirit of the prophet Samuel, who has since died, and gives him a prophecy of doom. What has been already said is coming to pass. He's going to die, his sons are going to die in this upcoming war with the Philistines. So last week we ended on this prophecy of doom from this spirit of Samuel brought up by a witch. It was a wild end to the lesson. But that's where we're going to pick up today. But let's pray before we get into it. Lord, I thank you for this day. I thank you for the opportunity and willingness of people to come out and study your word. Lord, I pray that you would enable us to bring some clarity to your word so that we would understand not just what the stories are, not just what the history is, but the different implications they have for our lives, and just a better understanding of who you are and how we interact with you. Pray be with us during this time. In your name, Jesus, I pray. Amen. One thing I noticed about the interaction with the Witch of Endor, I think if we really dug into it, I think there's probably a lot of interesting structuring going on in the book of 1 Samuel that we didn't cover. There's probably a lot of parallel things that happen. Because it occurred to me that if you recall, when King Saul first started having his problems that we saw weeks ago, when he had the evil spirit from the Lord, he had this depressive, kind of destructive spirit. You remember one of his servants said, "Oh, you know what? I know a guy. He can play the harp. He's a man of war, and the Spirit of God's with him." "Oh, okay. Go get that guy." And then now Saul has this new problem. Philistines are attacking. God won't speak to him. And a servant says, "You know what? I know someone. She has this familiar spirit, some sort of occult, demonic spirit that enables her to contact the dead. Let's go to her." There's like this negative parallelism that happens there. Originally his problem, the Spirit of the Lord, we need that guy. This time, this devilish, demonic spirit, Saul seeks her out. And that's where we get this prophecy of doom. So David is in Philistine territory, the Philistines are mounting, ready to attack, and Saul knows his doom is coming. So we're going to pick up in 1 Samuel chapter 29. We're going to be back with David as the Philistines are mustering troops. 1 Samuel 29, verse 1. Now the Philistines gathered together all their armies to Aphek, and the Israelites pitched by a fountain which is in Jezreel. And the lords of the Philistines passed on by hundreds and by thousands, but David and his men passed on rearward with Achish. Jump to verse 6. Achish, one of these Philistine lords, called David and said unto him, Surely, as the Lord liveth, thou hast been upright, and thy going out and thy coming in with me in the host is good in my sight, for I have not found evil in thee since the day of thy coming unto me unto this day. Nevertheless, the lords of the Philistines, the lords favor thee not. Wherefore now return and go in peace, that thou displease not the Lord of the Philistines. David said unto Achish, But what have I done? And for what hast thou found in thy servant so long as I have been with thee unto this day, that I may not go and fight against the enemies of my lord the king? First off, what are your thoughts with this interaction here? Did I set it up well enough? Do we understand what's happening here?
Was David going to go fight with the Philistines against the Israelites?
Seems like it, right? It's an odd situation because he's been raiding, as he's living in Philistine territory, he's been raiding some of the pagan nations and then claims that he's been actually attacking Israelites, so he's been lying to them as well. Yeah, it seems like he was fully ready to go and fight Israel, right? That's what I see, unless you want to speculate some grand deception, which is what the Philistines thought. They don't want him to come and fight. The lords of the Philistines say, no, fighting against your own people, he'll turn traitor. That's why they say, no, you guys go back. But I want to point out, I looked up, I knew the phrase was familiar, where David says in verse 8, it's just but what have I done? So, why can't I go do this? This comes up 3 times in the book of 1 Samuel, this exact phrase from David's mouth, what have I done? The first time is in 1 Samuel 20, that's when he's talking to Jonathan, King Saul's son, when Saul's trying to kill him. And in that verse, he came before Jonathan and said, what have I done? What is my iniquity? Why is your father, hunting to take my life? In chapter 26, when he's showing himself to King Saul that he had the opportunity to kill him and didn't, once again he says, what have I done? Or what evil is in my hand? And then to the Philistine lord, not able to go and attack Israel, now he says, what have I done? It's this same, twice it was legitimate, I've done nothing wrong, I'm in the right, I've been just. Why is this wickedness, why is this evil stuff happening to me? And now he's sort of he's switched a little bit. Something's off here, right? So he's saying now to the Philistine lord, what have I done that I can't go and attack God's people? It's a weird reversal. And this phrase only ever comes out of David's mouth in the book. And I don't know exactly, I'm sure there's more to explore with it, but it's interesting. David's in a weird spot. I think we can say that confidently. Okay, in your book on page 62, probably closer to the top, there's a sentence that starts with meanwhile. Meanwhile, the Philistine king was so impressed with David's reported conquests that he asked David to join him in a war against Israel. David at least appeared willing to do this, but he was providentially kept from fighting his own countrymen by the king's commanders, who expressed mistrust regarding David's loyalty. They predicted that David would prove a traitor if he remained among them. The king dismissed David and his men from further military service. David's attempt to handle his trials on his own was beginning to unravel. So, David and his men are sent back to Ziklag, their compound in the Philistine territory, and we're going to pick up with David in chapter 30, verse 1. And it came to pass, when David and his men were come to Ziklag on the third day, that the Amalekites had invaded the south, and Ziklag, and smitten Ziklag, and burned it with fire, and had taken the women captive that were therein. They slew not any, neither great nor small, but carried them away, and went their way. Jump down to verse 6. David was greatly distressed, for the people spoke of stoning him, because the soul of all the people was grieved, every man for his son and for his daughter, but David encouraged himself in the Lord. So we're going to go in your book again. I'll be in your book a lot. They do a good job of summarizing. David understood that when he stopped trusting God, things stopped working out. He'd gotten himself into a huge mess. Saul wanted to kill him, the Philistines didn't trust him, and the Amalekites had taken his family, and his own army wanted to stone him. David had nowhere to turn but God. He inquired of the Lord, and the Lord promised victory and total recovery of all that had been lost. David's 400 men pursued the enemy raiding party and encountered the reveling Amalekites across the brook Bezor. They battled 24 hours and recovered everything. Later, David shared the spoils with the neighboring Israelite communities. David turned to God when he made a mess of his situation is a key point. His humility is what made him different than Saul. God restored David and gave him power and wisdom to make things right. So they do a good job of summarizing all that happened there. He was able to get all their women back, all their children, all their possessions, and anything that was left over they distributed to the towns of the Israelites. And we're going to read one more section of text here, and that will wrap up this lesson that we're finishing. I know I'm not giving you much of a chance to talk and interact here. We just have some material to get through. So chapter 31. It's a short chapter. We're just going to read through it. Now, the Philistines fought against Israel, and the men of Israel fled from before the Philistines and fell down slain in Mount Gilboa. The Philistines followed hard upon Saul and upon his sons. The Philistines slew Jonathan and Abinadab and Melchishua, Saul's sons. And the battle went sore against Saul, and the archers hit him, and he was sore wounded of the archers. Then said Saul unto his armor-bearer, Draw thy sword, and thrust me through therewith, lest these uncircumcised come and thrust me through and abuse me. But his armor-bearer would not, for he was sore afraid. Therefore Saul took a sword and fell upon it. And when his armor-bearer saw that Saul was dead, he fell likewise upon his sword and died with him. So Saul died, and his 3 sons, and his armor-bearer, and all his men, that same day together. And when the men of Israel that were on the other side of the valley, and they that were on the other side of the Jordan, saw that the men of Israel fled, and that Saul and his sons were dead, they forsook the cities and fled. And the Philistines came and dwelt in them. Came to pass on the morrow, when the Philistines came to strip the slain, that they found Saul and his 3 sons fallen in Mount Gilboa. And they cut off his head, and stripped off his armor, and sent it into the land of the Philistines round about, to publish it in the house of their idols and among their people. They put his armor in the house of Ashtaroth, and they fastened his body to the wall of Bethshan. And when the inhabitants of Jabesh Gilead heard of that which the Philistines had done to Saul, all the valiant men arose, and went all night, and took the body of Saul and the bodies of his sons from the wall of Bethshan, came to Jabesh, and burnt them there. And they took their bones and buried them under a tree at Jabesh, and fasted 7 days. And that is how the book of 1 Samuel abruptly ends. We have the death of King Saul and his sons, one of the few suicides in the Bible. Not that his death was not imminent anyway, but just a note. So we have Jonathan, who we really liked, good friend of David. He's dead as well. Most of Saul's other sons are dead. And it's interesting. We talked a few weeks ago about how even today the Israelites, Jewish people, have a respect for Saul as their first king, even though he was kind of monstrous. And even here, I think you see a bit of that. The Philistines, mutilate his corpse. They cut off his head. They have the body hung in one place. They have the head in one of their cultic temples. But the men of a certain town still, this was still our king. They go and they get the remains back, and they have it more properly buried, more respectful. They don't let the offense stand. But that's how 1 Samuel ends. It started with Samuel and ends with the death of Saul, and now we're going to focus more heavily on David as a king coming up now. Okay, yeah, we should be able to get through this. All right, we're going to jump to page 65 in your book. We'll skip the questions here because we'll have a little bit to talk about together in a minute. But the book does a good job of telling you kind of what all this was about. So below questions 1 and 2, we see David's road to the throne took many years to travel. Furthermore, those years were filled with severe hardships. Yet David learned to wait patiently because of those hardships. And it may not seem like that big of a stretch of time because we've been, it's like 2 weeks that we've been talking about it. But this whole time of David on the run that we mostly talked about last week was 2 to 3 years of his life. There's a little disagreement or kind of vague on the time frames. But he had known he was anointed before he went into the service of Saul. He served Saul faithfully and then was running from Saul for another 2 to 3 years, dealing with all these troubles and constantly having to come back and trust God, even as he made mistakes, even as there were failures. He would just always continually come back to God. But let's look at 2 Samuel chapter 1, verse 1. Now it came to pass after the death of Saul, when David was returned from the slaughter of the Amalekites, and David had abode 2 days in Ziklag, it came to pass on the 3rd day that, behold, a man came out of the camp from Saul, with his clothes rent and earth upon his head. And so it was, when he came to David, that he fell to the earth and did obeisance. David said unto him, From whence comest thou? And he said unto him, Out of the camp of Israel I am escaped. David said unto him, How went the matter? I pray thee, tell me. And he answered, that the people are fled from the battle, and many of the people also are fallen dead, and Saul and Jonathan his son are dead also. David said unto the young man that told him, How knowest thou that Saul and Jonathan his son be dead? The young man that told him said, As I happened by chance upon Mount Gilboa, behold, Saul leaned upon his spear, and lo, the chariots and the horsemen followed hard after him. And when he looked behind him, he saw me, and called unto me, and I answered, Here am I. And he said unto him, Who art thou? I answered him and said, I am an Amalekite. He said unto me again, Stand, I pray thee, upon me, and slay me, for anguish is come upon me, because my life is yet whole in me. So I stood upon him and slew him, because I was sure that he could not live after that he was fallen. And I took the crown that was upon his head, and the bracelet that was on his arm, and have brought them hither unto my lord. Then David took hold of his clothes, and rent them, and likewise all his men that were with him. They mourned and wept and fasted until evening, for Saul and Jonathan his son, and for the people of the Lord, and for the house of Israel, because they were fallen by the sword. How did Saul die? What did we just talk about? Yeah. Right. So he was injured from an archer, He asked his armor bearer, hey, just kill me. They're going to do much worse. The armor bearer won't do it, so he fell on his sword. So what just happened here?
Did he just happen by when Saul's already dead? You know?
Yeah, what? Right. Okay. Yeah, so. Yeah. Oof, that's tough. You'll need a new preaching Bible, yeah. All right, so, okay, we're throwing some ideas around. What did this guy claim right off the bat? Just go with there. What did this Amalekite say?
He claimed that Saul fell on the spear, wasn't quite dead, and he asked him to kill him because he claimed he was an Amalekite rather than he's a Philistine.
Mm-hmm.
And said he killed him and then took his bracelet and crown and left.
So, did this happen?
Probably more likely this guy was a looter rather than a...
Yeah.
Well, it might have been more of a looter given a crown loser, right? Because, hey, I know he's the king.
Yeah.
Because they have to know about David, right?
Oh, yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, it's kind of like,
Mm-hmm.
who's going to be next in charge?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it seems from everything we have in front of us that this guy is lying. And, you'll have some critical scholars that will say, oh, well, there's obviously a contradiction. Well, so 1 Samuel to 2 Kings is one literary unit. So to get this wrong would literally be like you writing two sentences back to back, totally contradicting each other. Like the odds of even a normal person under normal circumstances trying to write something, let alone the divine inspiration that Christians consider the Bible to be written with, even if you were writing a story and you're like, oh, the king died this way, and then the next chapter you're like, oh, but he actually died this way. Like that's how ridiculous that claim would be. Like mistakes that you don't even make, and that scribes and rabbis over the last several thousand years just never caught that, So, yeah, it seems that this guy is just making things up to try to get in good with who he expects will be the new king, David. I assume he actually has Saul's crown and bracelet. Otherwise, that would be quite a claim. I brought you the crown and bracelet. Like, he's got to have them. So yeah, he's probably like a looter. Maybe he was working with the Philistines. It's hard to say exactly. But he is definitely not giving a true account of events. And he thinks it is going to be for his own benefit. And it is not. We won't read this because we have some other stuff to read, but David has this man killed immediately. He has the Amalekite killed because his whole ethic this whole time is, I won't touch King Saul. I'm not in a position to kill the Lord's anointed. If the Lord wants anything to happen, the Lord will sort this out. So he says, what? You would presume to kill the Lord's anointed? You're not he's a foreigner, a pagan. You're going to kill the Lord's anointed? So he has him executed. And then listen or read along. There's a song that happens in verse 17. David lamented with this lamentation over Saul and over Jonathan his son. Also, by the way, he taught them to teach the children of Judah the use of the bow. Behold, it's written in the book of Jasher. Some other book that we do not have that the author is referencing. This is how the lamentation goes. Verse 19. The beauty of Israel is slain upon the high places. How are the mighty fallen? Tell it not in Gath, publish it not in the streets of Ashkelon, lest the daughters of the Philistines rejoice, lest the daughters of the uncircumcised triumph. Yet, ye mountains of Gilboa, let there be no dew, neither let there be rain upon you, nor fields of offerings. For the shield of the mighty is vilely cast away, the shield of Saul, as though it had not been anointed with oil. From the blood of the slain, from the fat of the mighty, the bow of Jonathan turned not back, and the sword of Saul returned not empty. Saul and Jonathan were lovely and pleasant in their lives, and in their deaths they were not divided. They were swifter than eagles, they were stronger than lions. Ye daughters of Israel, weep over Saul, who clothed you in scarlet with other delights, who put on ornaments of gold upon your apparel. How the mighty are fallen in the midst of battle. O Jonathan, thou wast slain in the high places. I am distressed for thee, my brother Jonathan. Very pleasant hast thou been unto me. Thy love to me has been wonderful, passing the love of women. How are the mighty fallen, and the weapons of war perished? What do you think about this song? It was nice.
It's kind of like speaking good of the dead,
Mm-hmm.
like not speaking ill of them.
Yeah.
Nobody really goes to a funeral and says, this guy was the worst. Even if he was,
Yeah.
they come up with something that, well, you know what, he did have that lady across the street like that.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting that I think it speaks extremely well of his character, David, that after Saul making himself David's enemy for years now, at the end he will only praise him for the good that he's done in Israel. So if anyone has every right to blast Saul, to maybe he would be the one to, kind of desecrate the tomb of Saul, to desecrate the memory of Saul, to tell everyone, hey, maybe you guys didn't know what was going on in the throne room here, but here's how it really was. He just takes his time to write a beautiful lament, and the refrain seems to be how the mighty have fallen, which maybe there's a double entendre there, because Saul was the mighty one who throughout his whole reign fell, but it's a very nice thing. It speaks very highly of David's character and his respect that he still had for the king and the position despite years of turmoil at his hand. Yeah. Yeah, he writes how awesome their friendship was, into a song that he teaches the whole country, And I don't know if it was ever used as something like a song, like a lament among the Hebrews, because it's also apparently it's talked about in this other book, the book of Jasher, which we don't have. That's just another book that was in the Hebrew courts, I guess. It's interesting, very interesting. All right, chapter 2, verse 1. Came to pass after this that David inquired of the Lord, saying, shall I go up into any of the cities of Judah? And the Lord said unto him, go up. And David said, where shall I go up? He said unto him, unto Hebron. So David went up thither, and his two wives also, Ahinoam the Jezreelitess, and Abigail, Nabal's wife, the Carmelite. And his men that were with him did David bring up, every man with his household, and they dwelt in the cities of Hebron. And the men of Judah came, and there they anointed David king over the house of Judah. They told David, saying that the men of Jabesh Gilead were they that buried Saul. So right away, after Saul and most of his sons are dead, there's the power vacuum. Who's going to be king? David knows, okay, well, this is the time. He asks the Lord, immediately inquires of God what to do, go up to Hebron. Men from Judah, that's the large southern tribe that he's a part of. Bethlehem was in Judah. They come and anoint him king immediately. His own people rally around him, and he's king of Judah. Okay. Jump to verse 8. But Abner, the son of Ner, captain of Saul's host, so this is one of Saul's generals, took Ishbosheth, a son of Saul, and brought him over to Mahanaim, And they made him king over Gilead and over the Asherites and over Jezreel, over Ephraim and over Benjamin and over all Israel. And Ishbosheth, Saul's son, was 40 years old when he began to reign over Israel and reigned 2 years, but the house of Judah followed David. Okay, so this makes sense. We still have Israel as 12 tribes, even though they're a united group, mostly. The people in Judah anointed David to be king in Judah, and Abner, one of Saul's generals, took Saul's remaining son, who didn't die in the war, Ishbosheth, and made him king over basically anyone else who would have him as king, so the other tribes. So you kind of have a dual reign going on. David's in Judah. Ishbosheth, the son of Saul, is king over all these other parts of Israel. So there's going to be some conflict. Okay, in your book on page 67. Okay, it starts, God's new king began his reign in quietness. This is talking about David. He did not fight the tribes that initially failed to acknowledge his right to rule. Almost immediately, however, contention arose concerning his kingship. Abner, Saul's ruthless military leader, took matters into his own hands. At Mahanaim, 80 miles from Hebron, Abner anointed Saul's son Ishbosheth as king over the northern tribes. Abner and Joab each commanded a large company of soldiers. Neither man was willing to let God settle the issues that divided the nation. Abner became the aggressor and led his troops to Gibeon for a confrontation with Joab and his men over the issue. Okay, we'll look at this real quick because Kim asked a question before we even started the lesson tonight when we were just talking. There's a very odd situation that happens here. In chapter 2, verse 13, we'll start there. All right. And Joab, the son of Jeruah, and the servants of David, okay, I'm sorry. Just background. So we met Abner. He's one of the line of Saul's generals. We have this guy Joab. He is basically David's chief general. He's leading the troops. So verse 13. Joab, the son of Zeruiah, and the servants of David went out and met together by the pool of Gibeon, and they sat down, and the one on the one side of the pool and the other on the other side of the pool. Abner said to Joab, "Let the young men now arise and play before us." And Joab said, "Let them arise." Then there arose and went over by number 12 of Benjamin, which pertained to Ishbosheth, the son of Saul, and 12 of the servants of David. And they caught every one his fellow by the head, and thrust his sword in his fellow's side, so they fell down together, wherefore the place was called, I can't even pretend to pronounce that, which is in Gibeon. Okay, can anyone explain the situation that just happened there? Go ahead.
Yeah, they did we talked about this once before, I think in a different way. You get your best guy, one of your best guys, so they just decided on 12 each.
Mm-hmm.
If you've gone by that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's what it seems like. I don't understand the play terminology. I don't know if it was supposed to be unarmed combat or what. But they all seem to have swords with them, and everyone dies. So yeah, kind of like a David and Goliath thing where they say, okay, you bring out your champion, we'll bring out ours, and we'll let that decide the fate of this war. They brought 12 men each to this pool, and they were going to fight and say, okay, great. Which of the 12 we'll do it that way? And just everyone dies. And it launches the start of a civil war between these two parties. Okay, so actually we can just keep going in your book. Okay. It'll pick up at Abner's suggestion. 12 men from each army fought hand to hand to settle the issue. Each soldier grabbed his opponent by the hair of his head and thrust his sword into his side. All 24 fell down dead in that bloody battle. Angered by the indecision of the contest, both armies entered the brawl. 360 of Abner's men were slain, while Joab, David's people, lost 20 men. In the aftermath, Abner, Saul's general, regrettably killed Asahel, Joab's brother, who relentlessly pursued him. When the battle ended, both sides went home. Okay, so this turns into a skirmish, and Saul's general ends up killing the brother of David's general. He didn't want to. He actually, hey, the battle's done. Stop chasing me type thing. Hey, game's over. But he ends up having to kill him anyway. Okay. And we'll look in chapter 3. Chapter 3, verse 1. Now, there was a long war between the house of Saul and the house of David, but David waxed stronger and stronger, and the house of Saul waxed weaker and weaker. And then there's a couple verses to tell us that David acquired a few more wives, 6 in total, and has a son by each of them, and they are named in the next few verses. All right, verse 6. It came to pass, while there was war between the house of Saul and the house of David, that Abner, the general, made himself strong for the house of Saul. Now, Saul had a concubine whose name was Rizpah, the daughter of Aiah, and Ishbosheth, the son of Saul, said to Abner, "Wherefore hast thou gone in unto my father's concubine?" Okay, that may seem like a strange thing to say. It's a strange thing to say, okay? So you're dealing with Saul's only son left. He's on this throne, whatever land he still has. And there's a leftover concubine who was one of Saul's. And out of nowhere, because Joab it says he's making himself stronger for the house of Saul, you're kind of playing out another Saul and David situation, where you have the king who is starting to feel insecure, and he makes heavy accusations against his general. So you have the son of Saul now accusing his general baselessly of sleeping with his father's concubine. Okay, so verse 8. After this accusation, Abner was very wroth with the words of Ishbosheth, and said, "Am I a dog's head which against Judah do show kindness this day unto the house of Saul thy father, to his brethren, to his friends, and have not delivered thee into the hand of David, that thou chargest me today with a fault concerning this woman? So do God to Abner, and more also, except as the Lord has sworn to David, even so do I to him, to translate the kingdom from the house of Saul, and to set up the throne of David over Israel and over Judah, from Dan even to Beersheba." And he, Ishbosheth, could not answer Abner a word again, because he feared him. So because of this baseless accusation, Abner says, "You know what? I've been good to you this whole time. I've been good to your house, your father's house, but now I'm going to help do what the Lord has said is going to happen. I'm going to help translate this kingdom from the house of Saul to the house of David." So now Abner is no longer working for Saul. He's going to go and try to make peace with David. Okay. So Abner offers a treaty, and we'll look in your book on page 68. So he went to David to offer a treaty. The paragraph starts, "David accepted Abner's offer of a treaty on one condition, the return of Michal, David's first wife, who had been given to another man by Saul. After conferring with David, Abner rallied the remaining 11 tribes behind David. Jubilantly, Abner returned to Hebron to inform David of the good news. David celebrated by hosting a banquet in honor of Abner and his men. David then sent Abner away. When Joab heard that David had accepted Abner, he was furious, charging Abner with duplicity and opportunism. Secretly, Joab sent men to bring Abner back to Hebron. When Abner returned to Hebron, Joab and his brother Abishai met him and stabbed him to death for killing their brother Asahel." It was all going so well. Abner was leaving the house of Saul. He was coming to David. He said, "Okay, look, I'm with you now. Let me, I have pull with all these other tribes. I'm going to go and talk to them, see if they will agree. Saul's house is out. We're going with David. He meets with all these elders in Israel, and everyone's in. Everyone's for it. He comes back to David, says, great, we're good. We're going to get this whole thing rolling. Joab, David's general, is extremely unhappy about this because Abner killed his brother in the previous battle. Wasn't even really Abner's fault that he had to kill him. Like when you read the situation, the guy was just chasing him with a spear and wouldn't stop even though the battle was over. But because of this, Abner's heading back. He's like, all right, I'll do some business. We'll come back. Joab and his brother, another brother apparently, they call him back to say, oh, hey, no, David needs you back. And they take him aside and kill him. Okay, chapter 3, verse 31. David said to Joab and to all his people that were with him, rend your clothes, gird you with sackcloth, and mourn before Abner. And King David himself followed the bier. I'm not sure what that is. And they buried Abner in Hebron, and the king lifted up his voice and wept at the grave of Abner, and all the people wept. And the king lamented over Abner, and said, died Abner as a fool dies? Thy hands were not bound, nor thy feet put in fetters, as a man that falleth before wicked men, so fellest thou. And all the people wept again over him. And when all the people came to cause David to eat meat while it was yet day, David sware, saying, so do God to me, and more also, if I taste bread or aught else till the sun be down. And all the people took notice of it, and it pleased them, as whatsoever the king did pleased all the people. For all the people and all Israel understood that day it was not of the king to slay Abner the son of Ner. And the king said unto his servants, know ye not that there is a prince and a great man fallen this day in Israel? And I am this day weak, though anointed king, and these men, the sons of Zeruiah, be too hard for me. The Lord shall reward the doer of evil according to his wickedness. Question 7 in your book. Why would incidents such as Abner's murder try the patience of David as he waited to become king?
Because when they killed him, like Abner was in sort of the other tribes, and the sort of messenger just got bumped off.
Yeah, like his one go-between between the other tribes had just been killed. What else? Why do you think he makes such a big deal about the death of Abner? They have a burial. He's fasting. There's more music.
I want to make sure he didn't do it orchestrated.
How come?
Well, it makes sense to get rid of, Joab wanted to get rid of him because of the death of his brother, so it's only standing to reason because he was against David to begin with. If he didn't trust him, then get rid of the strongest guy he had.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so once again, David is showing that, his hand has never been officially against the house of Saul. So whether it's King Saul himself or his highest general, David has taken no action against these people. And that's important. I don't know that his reign could have been quite the same if he had gotten there by killing the previous people. That kind of gives your monarchy a different edge to it. And he's throughout trusting that God will do what he will to get David to be king. Did you have something? No. You looked like you were going to say something.
I was just going to add something real quick.
Yeah.
When the guy read the clothes,
Yeah.
and David himself followed the beard,
Yeah.
so evidently it's a framework where they put a coffin and or a corpse.
Oh.
And they take it to where they're taking it to be buried.
Was there a note in your Bible, or did you just know that?
Right in here.
Oh, nice. That's supercomputer there. Okay, so he's following the procession, the funeral procession. Good. Yeah, that word That word tripped me up. Hadn't heard that before. Okay. Chapter 4. We'll do verse 1. And when Saul's son heard that Abner was dead in Hebron, his hands were feeble, and all the Israelites were troubled. Jump to verse 5. And 2 of his generals, the sons of Rimmon, the Beerothite, these guys were named Rechab and Baanah, they went and came about the heat of the day to the house of Ishbosheth, who lay in a bed at noon. And they came thither into the midst of the house, as though they would have fetched wheat. And they smote him under the 5th rib, and Rechab and Baanah, his brother, escaped. And when they came into the house, he lay on his bed in the bedchamber. They smote him, they slew him, and beheaded him, and took his head and gat them away through the plain all night. And they brought the head of Ishbosheth unto David to Hebron, and said unto the king, Behold, the head of Ishbosheth, son of Saul, thine enemy, which sought thy life, and the Lord hath avenged my lord the king this day of Saul and of his seed. Any guesses as to how this situation is going to go? Party? Yeah.
Good job.
Yeah, predict the future. How's David feel about this?
They're not gonna survive.
Yeah, they're probably not going to survive.
Do you think these guys maybe after him or before, or even with other people, you think they just don't know all these things that are going on? I mean, or are they just stupid? You know what I mean?
No, you have to imagine that they legitimately don't know.
Just curious, because it seems.
Well,
Because we did the whole picture.
yeah.
And probably some of this is probably straight up decision to be loyal to the next king.
Yeah.
We're going to get rid of his high level enemies
Mm-hmm.
and show our loyalty has changed.
Right.
And so, which seemed, the way these guys thought like that made sense.
It makes perfect sense. Yeah.
They did it with Sandra back then.
Right, yeah.
You destroy
So
everything.
it makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah, the only thing about stuff like this, if people remember how a king came to power,
Mm.
and if it's just in a bad sense, they never forget that.
Mm-hmm.
And so David keeping his hands off everything is probably good for the entirety of the country.
Mm-hmm.
And people will remember whether they like it or not, because evidently for a while people would kind of get on board.
Yeah.
That it will matter in the end.
Mm-hmm.
That he was clean. He was clean.
Yeah.
I mean, that kind of thing.
Yep.
But this would probably make sense to the guys that did it.
Yeah.
Because they did that, all the way through forever with kings.
Yeah, it's a good move.
And everything. That's how you got rid of the competition.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yep. Okay. So yeah, that's exactly what happens. So David actually recounts. So did you notice in verse 8 their claim was verse 8? Yep, verse 8. When they bring him the head, they say, We brought the head of Ishbosheth, the son of Saul, thine enemy, which sought thy life, and the Lord has avenged my lord the king this day of Saul and of his seed. They claim like, hey, we're doing God's work for you. And David actually goes into a section where he recounts like, no, this is how the Lord has provided for me. That's not what you're doing. And he has both of these men killed. So anyone who had anything to do with the death of Saul or any of his sons was put to death. Okay, in your book on page 69, there's a paragraph that starts, Upon the death of Ishbosheth, all opposition collapsed, and David became the undisputed king over Israel. The Philistines still occupied strategic cities in the coastal plains and Jezreel Valley. Soon, David's territory would expand significantly. Recognizing David's past leadership, the elders from the northern tribes gathered at Hebron to anoint David king. They admitted David had been more of a king to them than Saul had, and they confessed he was the Lord's choice. So yeah, especially with the last son of Saul out of the way, David sort of just becomes the undisputed ruler. He's already been ruling in Judah. He rules just in Judah for 11 years. It's a longer stint than we were able to give it, and even the text allows for it. He reigns in Judah for quite a long time, just Judah, and then after the death of Ishbosheth, all the other elders come together and anoint him king over the entire country. Okay. And we just got one last thing that happens. Okay, on page 70 in your book, David decides that he needs a capital. So he's been in Hebron, in Judah. He wants to move the capital to Jerusalem, which is where you might commonly know that's like the capital city of Israel. Going forward, that's where the temple's going to be, that's where the palace is. So, okay, remember from last series in Judges, do we remember who the Jebusites were by chance? No is a perfectly acceptable answer, because this was, last series. The Jebusites were a pagan people in a walled city that they sort of conquered, but then they didn't live there. They didn't occupy the land. And even in the time of Judges, it gets re-inhabited by more Jebusites. But this is the place that David wants. So in your book, on page 70, there's a paragraph. The Jebusites believed that their 11-acre city was so impregnable that it could be defended by blind and crippled people. They mock David and say, hey, yeah, we'll send our blinds and cripples to guard the gates from you guys. David offered the post of chief captain to anyone who could capture the city. He saw that the water shaft or tunnel could provide entry into the city. Joab accepted the challenge and by risking his life won the title. David and Joab supervised the rebuilding of Jerusalem. So he takes the city through this, they call it like a water tunnel, think of an aqueduct but underground, and that's how they were able to get up into the city. And Pastor, you may know this off the top of your head. Did they find this tunnel, or was it Hezekiah's tunnel? Mm-hmm.
It's in the same vein, but that's...
Yeah, it might be Hezekiah's tunnel that they found, because archaeologists found this. That's the one with the seal in the center, right?
Yeah, it's Hezekiah's tunnel.
Okay. Yeah, Hezekiah does a lot. He's going to be a king several hundred years from now. He's a good king in Judah, and archaeologists actually found his constructed water tunnel, like a new water system that he set up. And they found, he did it quickly. This doesn't really relate, but they started from both sides, from like where the water source needed to come from and where it needs to go. And building teams tunneled till they met in the middle. And the reason they know it was, hey, we found Hezekiah's tunnel. They found an inscription in the center where the two building teams met. So they put the tunnel built under Hezekiah, like a whole thing of who built it, why it was built, like in the dead center of this water tunnel, where no one's ever going to see this, but the guys who met in the center put this inscription, and sometime in the 1900s this was discovered, and it's pretty cool. But similar idea. They conquered Jerusalem by sneaking in through a water tunnel. And then David gets his first big chance as king over the whole nation. Chapter 5, verse 17. When the Philistines heard that they had anointed David king over all Israel, all the Philistines came up to seek David, and David heard of it and went down to the hold. The Philistines also came and spread themselves in the valley of Rephaim. David inquired of the Lord, saying, "Shall I go up to the Philistines? Wilt thou deliver them into my hand?" The Lord said unto David, "Go up, for I will doubtless deliver the Philistines into thy hand." David came to Baal-perazim, and David smote them there, and said, "The Lord is broken forth upon my enemies, therefore as the breach of waters." Therefore he called the name of the place Baal-perazim. And there they left their images, and David and his men burned them. And the Philistines came up yet again, spread themselves in the valley of Rephaim. And when David inquired of the Lord, he said, "Thou shalt not go up, but fetch a compass behind them, and come upon over them against the mulberry trees. And let it be when thou heardest the sound of a going in the tops of the mulberry trees, that then thou shalt bestir thyself, for then shall the Lord go out before thee to smite the host of the Philistines." David did so, as the Lord had commanded him, and smote the Philistines from Geba until thou come unto Gazer. We'll end on this, but this is David's first big battle as ruler of the entire nation. What jumped out at you from that quick little story? He did what the Lord told him to do. Yes, he asked. That's a huge point. He just, right off the bat, he asked the Lord, "Okay, great, what do I do here?" And it worked out. Any other thoughts? Anything jump out at you?
I have a question.
Sure.
When he says, "Shall I go up," what does that mean?
Oh, I think I don't know if there's cardinal directions involved. Like, I don't know if it's to the north, but it's, "Shall I go up to battle?"
Well,
Like,
you're going to ask because that's what I took it as.
yeah.
But he says, "No, don't do that in the second one.
Mhm.
Don't do that." But then the Lord has them end up killing them anyway. So I don't know. It just seems a little off. What am I missing?
Wasn't he down in the hold? So does that mean he was under the ground somewhere?
Oh, was he in the hold, or were the Philistines in the hold? Oh, yeah, no, he was in the hold. You're right. David heard of it and went down to the hold. Yeah, so makes sense. He's in some sort of fortress thing.
But then God sends them, but just a different way. So
Mhm.
did up mean up?
Probably.
What do you think?
Well, I think you can use it in both terms, you know.
No, it almost seems like
a fortress he went to for protection.
yeah. It just seems like okay. After God says, "Thou shalt not,"
Yeah.
I expect the next few verses to you let him go or something.
Mhm.
You know.
Yeah.
You see what I mean?
Yeah. Does anyone have thoughts on that?
Is there another way out from that the path?
Yeah. Yeah, so there probably is. So I take it as he asked God the first time, should we go, we're just going to go up, come out of the hold, we're going to fight them. God gives him the victory. And I think it's very important that he asks a second time. Like he interacts with God another time. It's not just, "Oh, Philistines again? This is old hat. We just did this." He asks God again, "Should we go up?" He goes, no, and he has a different plan. He doesn't achieve victory the same way twice, and it's important that David asked both times.
So maybe up means just direct on battle,
Mm-hmm.
and where this wasn't direct on, this was go around here and approach it from a different angle kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, that's what ends up happening. So,
But it just seems weird to me because when he said no, it just seemed like the next verse was going to say something which he did not say.
I got you. Well, and it's interesting that, so the first time is very straightforward, and then they do this whole thing, they hide behind they route up around this group of mulberry trees that I guess hides them from view. And he says, "Wait until you kind of hear a stirring in the trees." Second half of verse 24. "For then the Lord shall go out before thee and smite the host of the Philistines." So it's almost like, one, it's important that David sought the Lord both times. The first time it was just a straight-on victory. Hey, yeah, you guys are going to go up from the hole, go up from the fortress, conquered them, beat them in that battle. But then the second time, you're doing something different. God's not giving you victory the same way twice. But then they're very explicit. The Lord is involved. Not that he wasn't involved the first time, but he says the Lord will go out before you. And that's what I kind of feel like this is a moment where David's kingship, as it should always, like as the kingship always should have been, is on full display. Because that was the thing. It was back from the time of Moses, the Lord is our warrior, the Lord fights our battles. When the time of the judges came, the Lord would raise up someone specific to go and fight the battles. And then when the people wanted a king, they say, oh, we want a king to fight our battles for us. You know, they rejected the Lord in that sense. And as David is having his first confrontation as king of the whole country, what God does for him is the Lord gives him victory, but the Lord is the one who fights his battles for him. Even though David has military might, he has strength, he has the courage, the skill, that's not what God actually needs from him. He needs someone who's going to follow him and let God actually be the one to do what God always wanted to do for them. The Lord fights the battles in this situation. So that's kind of what I take on that. That's what we have for our lesson tonight. We went through a ton of stuff because we finished up last week's lesson, the death of Saul. We took it through David being over part of the country, the death of Saul's line, David over the whole country, and his first big battle shows how he depends on the Lord. Any thoughts, questions, concerns, anything?
The sovereign will of God in purpose is worked out through the works of man and the history of man. Even though God doesn't violate man's conscience or will. So that's interesting because everything got brought to pass and we got all this intrigue and slaughter and just everything, you know. But God's will was still accomplished.
Yeah.
And we can see it here because we got the picture. But as these guys are living this out, I'm not so sure they were thinking all that.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Sure.
And so we usually don't think that in our own lives either. You know, we're living this out. And we're kind of like, you know, but God has purpose, God has plan. Even like for David, his life, our lives too, you know. And so even though it might look pretty rough, God is still working out his plan for your life, my life, your life. I mean, it's there. And we ought not ever forget God's sovereign will, even though he doesn't violate our conscience or our will. But it's interesting how God can work that all out. You know, it's worked out. So,
Yeah.
so I think that's, and God gave it where he wanted to be.
Yeah.
And, you know, even though David made some mistakes along the way, it looks like, or he got a little shaky about some things, that you see that God took care of him, and he got him where he wanted him to be. So God will get us where he wants us to be in his sovereign will, even though it might look pretty difficult, distressing, disturbing, you know. And you might even have a good day or two once in a while, right? You know, that's allowed too, you know, so God, you know. So I think that's really interesting how this, you know, that was a major thing to get rid of, I shouldn't say that, to get rid of Saul's beginning of the dynasty, the first king.
Yeah.
That was a major thing to take a switch and go to somebody else. Giant thing, yeah. I'm done.
Yeah. No, I can hear your Sunday sermon forming a little bit there.
No, I got something else.
Sure.
I got something else.
Yeah.
Well, we've talked before about how God can or will use I'll just say an ungodly person, especially at this time, as a tool to get this done over here, right? We've talked about that kind of thing before. Now, this probably didn't happen, what you're saying, but, no, I mean, what you're saying happened, but what I'm saying is, you know, like, those couple of fellas who killed those guys and brought the heads and stuff, you don't think they were so, like, God, we're on a mission from God. Because they did say that.
Yeah.
And he used us.
Yeah.
So maybe, are we gonna talk more about David again?
Yeah.
Are you gonna talk about how, like, he likes to ask questions, we know that, because even though he asked God, which is great,
Yeah.
that other guy, he was asking questions all the time.
Mm-hmm.
It's like he's learning how to be king this whole time. And then, not to be funny, but this whole women thing, my goodness, I mean, now he's got more than two, and he wanted the other one in on a deal,
Mm-hmm.
you know, and just maybe bring that up, because I know that happens later on too, so.
Well, so notice he now has 7. He has 7 wives.
See, I've lost count.
Yeah, because he was initially married to King Saul's daughter, and then when he was on the run, he married 2 more. And the text mentioned 6, with 6 sons, and then the original one was brought back into the picture.
Does he get her back? Because that guy didn't even make it back when they made the agreement.
Yes. Yeah, that was somewhere in the deluge of text that we could not read. Yeah, he does get her back. She's been married to another man for several years, and the man is very upset about this. To the point where you're kind of like when he makes the demand, you're like, oh yeah, he wants the wife that was taken from him back. That seems perfectly reasonable. And then the husband, so then the husband is like weeping as he follows them away, and Abner sends him back. But yeah, like it's another situation where you don't know how to feel about it because you feel really uncomfortable. But yeah, who knows? They don't mention it. But yeah, God. Oh, sure. Mary's back into the line of Saul. But he did care for her as well, Saul's daughter. David. Yeah. Yeah, he wanted her back. Yeah. But all that to say, yeah, God definitely still had his purposes accomplished, even though he did not lead these men to kill anyone. Like you said, he didn't violate their conscience. These men acted of their own accord, and yet somehow in God's sovereign plan and understanding and will, the things that he wanted to happen occurred. I don't think they had to happen that way. They don't have to happen the way they did. It's kind of, there's stuff we can get into too much. I don't want to launch into a whole full thing about destiny and God's will and free will of man. So we'll leave it there. God's will was accomplished even through wicked people acting of their own accord. Still, God's plan falls into place at the end. So yeah, we definitely get a lesson in the sovereignty of God, the character of godly men, what makes a man godly, like being perfect or continually turning back to God. So next week we're going to keep looking at King David and his rule, and he's going to have some problems of his own coming up. So let's close in word of prayer. Lord, I thank you for this study, for this long run through a whole big chunk of the Word, and I just pray that even in these dense narrative sections, these dense historical sections, that we would see your heart and what it means to really follow you and just to work according to what you have for us and understand how your will ultimately plays out in our lives. So I pray that you would keep some of these ideas in our heart and mind and just bring us back safely to study your word more deeply next week. In your name, Jesus, I pray. Amen. All right, thank you.